The hospital's automated phone call came through shortly after 11:30 that night, sharp and unforgiving, cutting through the soft hum of my condo where my wedding dress hung draped over the bedroom armchair. Tomorrow I was supposed to marry Major Adrian Hayes. My mother was supposed to sit in the front row, smile through happy tears, watch me walk down the aisle. Instead, her doctor told me the surgical team would not wheel her into the operating room unless a $50,000 emergency deposit was settled before sunrise. No payment, no life-saving procedure. My checking account held barely $3,000. There was nowhere else I could turn this late. I grabbed my keys and drove across town to the gated apartment complex where Adrian lived. Rain streaked my windshield, thin, cold November rain that blurred the streetlights into fuzzy gold blurs. My hands shook against the steering wheel. I kept replaying the doctor's words in my head, trying to think of any alternative, any loan, any friend who could come up with that kind of cash on a few hours' notice. There was none. Adrian could cover it easily. As an active-duty Army major, his salary was substantial, his savings solid. We were hours away from being husband and wife. I told myself he would understand. That is what partners did for each other in crisis. When he unlocked his front door, he was still dressed in his uniform trousers and a plain gray undershirt, tired from a long day of base briefing. He could read panic on my face the second I stepped inside. I did not waste time on small talk. I laid out my mother's situation, the sudden complication, the hard deadline hanging over her life. My voice cracked as I said the number 50,000. I did not come demanding the money as a gift. I told him I would sign whatever paperwork he wanted, that I would pay every cent back out of my RN paychecks over the coming years, no matter how long. I just needed her to get through. Adrian went, his jaw. He did not ask about my mother's skin. He did not ask about her pain or her prognosis. His gaze fixed on the dollar figure, as if that single number outweighed everything else. He paced across his living room once, twice, arms folded across his chest, stood there, wedding eve makeup smudged at edges, feeling smaller by the second. For a terrible minute I feared he would know, that I would watch my mother's chance slip away because I could not produce the deposit. Finally he tapped at his banking app, transferring the full amount directly to the hospital's. The confirmation ping sounded crisp in the room. My shoulders sagged with raw, overwhelming relief. My mother would get her surgery, but something shifted between us in that moment. Gratitude tangled with a heavy, ugly kind of indebtedness I had never anticipated. Adrian did not hold me, did not offer gentle reassurance, just looked at me. This is not something I do to anyone, he said flatly. You need to understand. I nodded, too overwhelmed to parse every layer. At the time, I told myself he only stressed, that the weight of such a large transfer. I rushed back to the hospital to sit with my mom, leaving Adrian alone. On the drive over, I kept thinking of tomorrow's wedding, about the future we were supposed to build together. Yet that $50,000 transfer all hung between us, invisible, enormous. It was not merely money, it was a marker, a debt that would never show up on any statement, but one he would hold over me for years to come. When I walked into the hospital waiting room, my phone lit up with a short text from Adrian. There was no warm wish for recovery. Only, don't forget what our family tonight. I heard at those words, and for the first time since the proposal, I wondered what exactly I was prying into. The wedding went ahead 48 hours later, though half of me still felt stuck back in Adrian's apartment on that rainy pre-dawn night. My mother was still confined to her hospital bed, her surgery complete, but recovery far from certain. She could not sit in the front pew as planned, could not squeeze my hand before I walked down the aisle. I wore my ivory gown anyway, smiled for the photographer, and said my vows beneath draped white roses. Friends and military base acquaintances filled the pews, cheering for Major Hayes and his new bride. To everyone watching, it was a perfect, hopeful military wedding. No one knew the heavy unspoken contract tucked beneath our happiness. Adrian was polite through every toast and every dance. He held my waist for our first dance, his movements steady, but there was a cool distance in his touch that had not existed before the hospital deposit. For most of the reception, he kept the conversation light, never uttering the $50,000 number out loud in front of guests. I kept waiting for that wait to fade, for us to go back to the easy warmth we had shared before the emergency hit. It never quite happened. Maya pulled me aside in a quiet corner of the venue halfway through the reception, while Adrian was busy greeting his commanding officers. She studied my face, her brow furrowed. She had heard the condensed version of what had happened with my mom's medical bill. He really just wired that much money overnight? She asked, keeping her voice low so nearby guests could not overhear. Lila, money that big changes things, even between people who love each other. I shook my head, brushing off her concern. I told myself I was being overly sensitive, that stress from my mother's surgery and the chaotic wedding schedule was warping my perspective. Adrian had saved my mom's life. I owed him gratitude. I refused to frame his help as something manipulative. He did the right thing, I told him. I will pay every dollar back. It will blow. Maya did not look convinced, but she dropped the subject, not wanting to ruin my wedding. Our honeymoon was a short beach trip down the Virginia coast. We stayed in a quiet oceanfront condo, walked along the shore at sunset, and tried to settle into being newlyweds. Yet the shadow of that payment lingered just below the surface. Adrian never brought it up during peaceful months. He saved those remarks for small disagreements. If I pushed back about dinners, or mentioned picking up extra shifts at the hospital where I worked as a subtle reminder would bout. Nothing blunt, nothing. Just quiet loaded. We returned home and moved into base-provided housing, a neat 3-bedroom townhouse surrounded by other military. Life fell into routine. Early morning base briefings for Adrian, long hospital shifts. Most days felt normal. Then one evening, barely 3 weeks out, we sat over takeout on our kitchen counter. I mentioned I wanted to set up a separate automatic monthly transfer, starting to chip away at the $50,000. That was when he set down his fork and leaned back in a chair, staring across. You don't need to send me month checks, he said. I didn't do it so you could shuffle money back and forth out of your nurse paycheck. I did it for us, for your family. You should do that. My stomach twisted. I tried to explain that paying him back mattered to myself, that I hated carrying this kind of obligation. Adrian waved my words away like they were trivial. The message was clear. Cash repayment wasn't what he wanted. He wanted remembrance, my gratitude, a permanent weight in the background of every argument. Later that night, I stood by the bedroom window, watching military spouses walk their dogs on the side. Everyone on this base saw Adrian as a generous, honorable husband. Only I could feel the invisible string tying me to that night before the wedding. I texted Maya, brief and guarded, described the conversation. Her came quickly. He wants your money. He wants leverage. Stared at the screen, and for the first time I could not find an excuse to defend behavior. Life on base grew lonelier after that coffee gathering. Most of the military spouse community only knew Adrian's version of the story. When we ran into neighbors at the commissary or the base gym, many treated me with a subtle, patronizing kindness, as if I ought to walk around endlessly thankful for my husband's great sacrifice. No one knew how heavy that supposed gratitude felt. I started pulling back from casual social events. I avoided group potlucks, skipped spouse club meetings, and made excuses whenever people invited us over. Isolation settled over me slow and soft. My shifts at the hospital became my safest escape. Inside the ER, I was Lila, a skilled registered nurse. No one referenced my mother's surgery or the $50,000 favor. I focused on patients, on reading vital signs, on stitching wounds and calming scared families. For 12 hours at a time, the weight of my marriage faded into the background. The second I climbed back into my car and headed toward base housing, it all settled right back onto my shoulder. Maya kept pushing me to talk, and we met for dinner one Friday night away from the base, at a quiet neighborhood diner off post. The booth was dim, and the clink of silverware covered our conversation. She watched me pick at my salad, noticing how drained I looked. You're shrinking, she said plainly. You stop speaking up for yourself every time Adrian brings up that. That is not the woman I grew up. I got defensive immediately. Stress and shame made me dig in my heels. I told her marriage required compromise, that Adrian carried pressure from his military job, that maybe I was over-magnifying old wounds. I argued that most fights stemmed from miscommunication, not manipulation. Some part of me still hated admitting I had married into something harmful. Saying it out loud made it feel, and I was afraid of what that reality would mean for my. Maya's expression softened, hurt by my push. She did not yell or. She simply told me she would not keep arguing if I could not see it, but she would stay ready whenever I. We finished our meal in strained silence, and I drove home feeling even more alone. Not only was I alienated from the military spouse, now there was distance between my best friends. Back at the townhouse, Adrian noticed my foul mood the moment I walked through. I did not volunteer details about my dinner with Maya, but he me, asking question after question about what we had done. I held my guard up, giving only vagues. That only made him more. He grew convinced Maya was filling my head with bad ideas about her. A few nights later, I sat scrolling through my phone on the couch. A military spouse group post popped up on my social media feed. Someone had commented about Adrian's generosity toward me. Curious, I traced the thread backward. Adrian had shared the condensed story in the private online group for families. He had written about the emergency night before our wedding, about stepping in to save. Again, There was no mention of my prompt repay, no nuance about the pressure I had lived under. He was not just telling the story at in-person coffee visits. He was cementing this one-sided narrative in writing, for dozens of spouses to read and remember. Any future disagreement between us would be viewed through this written lens. If I ever put against him, people would think I was ungrateful for everything. My voice shook as I held up my phone and showed him the post. Adrian looked ashamed. He leaned back in his armchair, calm. "I want people to understand the burdens I took when I married you," he said. "It is part. Our history is not yours to rewrite for an online group." Back. "You leave out every part that makes me human. You paint me as someone who owes you less deference." Our argument stretched late into the evening. We circled the same points over and over. He framed my anger as ingratitude. I told him he was weaponizing a family crisis for social credit. No ground was gained. We went to bed in rooms that night. Lying awake in the guest room mattress, I realized I had made a terrible misjudgment. I thought marrying him would secure safety for my mother. Instead, I had walked into a situation where almost everyone around me already believed his version of events. The odds were stacked against me before any real fight even began. Base housing life settled into a rhythm of early alarms, overlapping work schedules, and the constant hum of other military families living inches away. Most days, Adrian and I functioned like any ordinary married couple. We grocery shopped together, fixed quick weeknight dinners, and made small talk about my hospital shifts and his base assignments. But the $50,000 ghost hovered, waiting for every spark of conflict to step into the room. It never surfaced over minor, trivial frustrations. It came out when I held firm to something that mattered to me. My mother's recovery dragged on. She needed ongoing physical therapy, prescription refills, and frequent follow-up doctor visits. Some of those costs fell outside her insurance coverage. One Tuesday evening, fresh home from a 12-hour hospital shift, I sat at the kitchen table scrolling through her medical bills. I told Adrian I planned to send a portion of my paycheck over each month to help cover those ongoing expenses. That was when the calm fractured. Adrian leaned against the kitchen door frame, arms folded, his military posture rigid. His voice stayed level, but there was sharp edge underneath every word. "Have you forgotten what I already did for your mother?" he said. "I covered that life-saving deposit. That should have been enough. Now you want to keep pouring more of our household income into her care? These are new costs," I answered, exhaustion fraying my patience. "She nearly died. She still needs support. This is my mom. I can't turn our money," he corrected, emphasizing the word our. "Your salary goes into this joint account. Every dollar you earn belongs to this mission." That statement knocked me back. I had never agreed that my RN income should be fully merged without boundaries. I had expected shared household expenses, but I still wanted personal autonomy over my earnings. I brought up the monthly repayments I had tried to start weeks earlier. If he would not accept regular checks, I suggested we draw up a simple, formal promise note, documenting the original $50,000 loan. At least then, the obligation would live on paper instead of floating as some endless, Adrian's expression hardened. "A promissory note would cheapen what I owe you," he said coldly. I acted love. "You want to turn my kindness into a business transaction? That tells me exactly." I felt guilt over me. He twisted my practical request into an insult against him. I backed off, setting the idea of legal paper aside, yet my resentment grew. He could wield that unwritten debt whenever it suited him, and there was no document. As the weeks passed, during fights, household chores, my long hospital hours, he would circle back to that night. Not screaming, not overtly cruel, quiet, cutting reminders of how much he had sacrificed for my family. Each time me shrank. I found myself picking my battles, biting back opinions I would have voiced freely before the crisis. I started feeling what I said, afraid of triggering that familiar reminder of everything I supported. Weekend, several military spouse neighbors dropped. The living room filled with laughter and casual talk. Half through the visit, Adrian recounted the story of my mother's emergency surgery. He framed himself as the self-sacrificing hero who had stepped in at the last. He did not mention my promise to repay, or how in. He only painted the picture of him rescuing my family. The women around the table nodded, offering him praise. I sat silent on the couch, cheeks burning hot. I could not contradict him in front of company without fight. Our guests left. I confronted him in the room. I told him it felt violating to air that private family crisis to our neighbors. Adrian shrugged it off. "They should know the kind of commitment to this marriage," he replied. I walked into our bedroom and closed me. leaned against the locked wood, stood clearly. The debt was no longer only between us doors. He was public narrative, one that cast me as someone forever beholden to his mercy. No amount of quiet gratitude would ever be enough to pay it off. The guest bedroom couch became my sleeping spot for nearly a full week. Adrian did not apologize for the social media post, and I refused to back down from my anger. We moved through the townhouse like two polite strangers, passing each other in hallways, coordinating grocery runs and household repairs without genuine conversation. At the hospital, I kept my focus steady on patient care, but the second my shift ended, dread coiled tight in my chest at the thought of going home. My mother's health took another sharp turn. A routine follow-up scan revealed complications from her surgery. She needed another short hospital stay, and more bills piled up. The stress weighed heavily on all of us. Diane called me one evening, her voice thin and tired, guilt lacing every word. She kept saying she wished she had never created that terrible financial emergency on the eve of my wedding. Hearing her blame herself cracked something open inside me. None of this was her fault, yet the fallout of her crisis had poisoned my marriage. I started digging through stacks of old digital files stored on our shared home laptop, hunting for any record tied to that $50,000 transfer. I was searching for proof of my original promise to repay, something I could hold on to when Adrian twisted the past. I sorted through bank receipts, old text message screenshots, and scattered PDF documents. Most of our early conversations existed only in memory. Then I stumbled across a saved draft of a promissory note. It had never been finalized, never been printed or signed. Adrian had typed it himself, dated for the night right before our wedding. The document laid out the full $50,000 principal, outlined a repayment schedule, and included clauses about what would happen if our marriage dissolved. My blood ran cold as I read it. He had considered formalizing this loan from the very start. He possessed every tool to lock this into legal writing, yet he chose not to execute. He had consciously rejected binding paperwork. A signed note would have limited his power. With a legal document in place, this would simply be debt. Without it, he kept the moral high, free to pull the favor out during every, free to perform generosity for friends and military acquaintances. He got the best of both. He could act like he had given me it, while still holding me accountable for the money whenever it's. I closed the file, making certain not to leave any trace that I found it. My head shook. I sat in the dim home office long after sunset, processing what this meant. This was not impulsive stress from a last-minute emergency. This was a choice he had made. When Adrian came home from base night, I did not confront him. I kept my neutral, dinner, and went through the motions of our quiet household. Inside, everything. Before the discovery, I had told myself his manipulation grew out of messlings, poor communication, and the pressure of the military. Now I understood it was. That night, he found me sitting on the porch, wrapped in a thin fleece against the. He tried to bridge the gap between us, soften his manner, acting as if our week of distance could dissolve without. He spoke about my mother's new back. But the old under. He hinted that he might step in again with additional funds if things desperate. Every kind-sounding word landed. I knew what accepting more help would cost me. More obligation, more leverage for him to use. I gave him a short, non-committal answer and stared out across the dark neighborhood. I could no longer tell myself he did not understand. He had both options, legal contract or immoral debt, and picked the one that gave him. The money itself had never been a weapon. The absence of paper was. The knowledge of that unsigned promissory note sat heavy in my chest, a secret I could not speak aloud. Going through the motions of marriage grew exhausting. Adrian softened his outward behavior, attempting to return us to normalcy. He brought home flowers, planned casual date nights, and spoke gently about my mother's slow recovery. None of it erased what I had read in that digital draft. Every thoughtful gesture now felt layered, as if he was performing kindness to paper over the power he had chosen to keep. My mother's recovery moved in fits and starts. Some days she made small progress, other days pain left her bedridden. Her medical bills piled higher, and guilt weighed on her constantly. She kept apologizing for the crisis that had blown up my marriage, unaware just how deeply that emergency payment had poisoned everything between Adrian and me. I could not bring myself to tell her the full truth. She had already suffered enough, and I refused to add my marital pain onto her burden. I carried it all alone. At work, my focus began to slip. Long ER shifts grew harder. I would zone out mid-charting, my mind drifting back to that pre-wedding, to the words inside the unsigned document. Coworkers noticed I was quieter than usual. One fellow nurse pulled me aside after a chaotic shift and asked if I was all right. I brushed the concern off, forcing a smile. I could not unpack my complicated marital situation at the hospital. Military spouse troubles rarely landed well in casual workplace conversation. I finally reached out to Maya. Swallowing my pride, I asked her to meet me at the lakeside park far away from base traffic. The afternoon wind whipped across the water, stirring fallen autumn leaves across the walk path. I laid everything: the story of the draft promissory, the online the constant quiet pressure I lived. I held nothing back. Maya listened without interruption. When I finished speaking, her face was... He knew exactly what he was. She said, "This isn't stress-fueled missteps. This is..." Adrian had sensed me pulling further away from him. He grew more able. Small household disagreements would quickly circle back to that $50,000. During one brutal late fight, he said plainly that I would not even have my mother alive if... The comment deep. I stepped back, telling him the money was never meant to purchase my... He only had, telling me I was ungrateful for everything. That fight broke whatever thin illusion I had left. I stopped trying to fix things between us in private. I no longer argued to his mind. I only defended myself. Pushed. Late one evening, after Adrian had fallen asleep, I sat at the kitchen table. I began researching attorneys who specialized in military spouse law. I read articles about marital financial coercion, about separating spousal gifts from de facto loans, about what options existed for someone trapped in this exact kind of a... I printed out a handful of consultation information, folded sheets small, and tucked them deep inside my work nurse's bag, where Adrian would look. I was not ready to file for divorce. I was not what I wanted, but I knew I could not keep living blind. I needed to understand legal standing, what rights I held, what risks I faced if I chose to push this marriage to a point. Standing in the window, I looked out across the rows of identical military townhouses. Every lit window held its own private struggles. No neighbor walking past would guess the quiet crisis unfolding inside our four walls. Outwardly, Major and Mrs. Hayes still looked like the stable, respected military couple. Inside, I was quietly preparing for the possibility that this marriage would survive. I kept the printed attorney contact sheets hidden at the bottom of my heavy nursing tote, buried under stethoscope covers, pen lights, and unused patient care forms. Every morning when I left for work, I carried those folded papers with me, a quiet reminder that I had options beyond the four walls of our townhouse. I did not rush to book a consultation. Fear held me back. Divorce within military circles carried heavy social weight, and I worried how my mother would cope if our marriage fell apart while she was still recovering. Adrian could sense my quiet withdrawal. He could not name the source of it, but he felt me slipping out of his influence. He doubled down on small performative gestures. He brought home expensive wine, planned dinner reservations at the nicest restaurant in town, and spoke of future home renovations we could start once his assignment renewed. Each generous offer landed hollow. Every promise of comfort was layered with the unspoken memory of that $50,000 payment. I worked to build my personal safety net piece by slow piece. During my lunch breaks at the hospital, I sat in my parked car and called credit unions off base. I opened a separate checking and savings account entirely in my own name, unlinked from any joint household finances Adrian controlled. I shifted small portions of my RN paycheck into this private account every pay cycle. It was not wealth, but it was mine, money he could not access or oversee. I also compiled screenshots of text message exchanges where Adrian had repeatedly weaponized the favor during arguments. I copied the draft promissory note file to a secure encrypted USB drive, which I slipped into my work bag alongside the attorney paperwork. I was gathering evidence, not for revenge, but so I would not walk into any legal meeting defenseless. Maya helped me think through every risk. We talked over the phone late at night, going over what would happen if Adrian discovered my private accounts and my growing stack of documentation. She warned me he could turn to the base community, leaning on his military rank to paint me as an ungrateful wife abandoning the man who had saved her. I knew that risk was... The one-sided narrative he had spread months earlier was already rooted in many people's minds. One Wednesday afternoon between hospital shifts, I finally dialed the family law attorney who specialized in military spouse cases. The consultation call was brief but sobering. The lawyer explained that because Adrian had voluntarily transferred the $50,000 without a signed written agreement, the court would most likely view it as a marital. My promise to repay existed only in verbal assurances and old text messages. Legally, I held no obligation to pay him back. Morally, however, Adrian had built an entire marriage around that supposed debt. The lawyer advised me to keep securing copies of all, and to avoid letting Adrian find out I was seeking legal advice before I was ready. I hung up the call sitting in my hospital parking lot, processing what... Legally, I was free of the $50,000 burden. Emotionally, its weight still pressed hard against chest. Law could erase financial obligation, but it could not undo the damage done between. When I arrived home that evening, I had rushed from my phone consultation straight toward my mute, and I had failed to tuck every printed legal note fully back inside the deep bottom. One thin slip of paper, the attorney's business card, peeked out from the. Adrian came over to grab for me, a rare helpful gesture, and his eyes landed on that card before I could. His posture shifted. The easy, neutral look on his finished. He held the small printed card between his fingers, it over, reading the family law firm's name printed across the front. The quiet pretense of our peaceful household shattered in a. "You have been talking to a divorce attorney," he said. It was not a question. His voice dropped low, sharp with disbelief and rising anger. All the carefully constructed pretense of gentle, generous husband fell completely away. The air in the townhouse turned frigid in an instant. Adrian gripped the attorney's business card between his thumb and index finger, his knuckles whitening. I stepped backward, my shoulder pressing against the front door, still wearing my scrubs, my work bag slung loose on one arm. There was no point lying. He had seen exactly what it was. "Yes, I spoke with a lawyer," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I needed to understand my options." "Your options?" Adrian repeated, the words heavy with scorn. "This is how you repay everything I did for your mother? You sneak behind my back and consult divorce attorneys while I am still trying to make this marriage work?" He tossed the card onto the entryway table like it was something filthy. His military training showed in the rigid set of his shoulders, the sharp, controlled cadence of his speech. He was not shouting, but every syllable cut deeper than yelling. He paced across the hallway, circling me, and brought the $50,000 payment roaring back into the room. All the careful, soft gestures of the past few weeks vanished completely. "I pulled you from disaster on the night before our wedding. I kept your mother from dying. I gave you security, a home, my name. And this is my reward? You plan to walk away as if none of it ever happened? I never said I wanted to walk away. But I cannot keep living under this unwritten. You bring up that money every time we disagree. You told our whole community your one-sided version of events. You drafted a promissory note and chose not to sign it so you could hold it over my head for it." Adrian froze. I had not intended to reveal I found that old, but the pressure of the confrontation pulled the truth. Surprise flickered across his face, quickly replaced by resentment. He did not. Instead, he twisted my discovery into another mark against my. "You went digging through my private files? You were spying on me and Mom?" "I was searching for proof of my promised pay. I wanted something real to counter the endless moral weight you keep." I laid out a concrete offer. I told him my new separate account was slow growing. I would take on extra weekend ER shifts, pick up overtime whenever the hospital would let me, and pay the full $50,000 sum back to him in full within. No conditions, no loopholes. Once the last transfer cleared, there would be more debt, no favors, no more references to that pre-wedding night. Adrian rejected the offer with, "I do not want your overtime, Lila. Not see that." And rose. "The damn already done. It is not about principle. It is about loyalty. When I needed you to stand beside me, you started an exit." The argument stretched late into the night. We went in circles. He demanded I discard all legal contacts, shut down my bank account, and return fully to our old life, trusting him. I refused to dismantle the safety net I had built. I would not give up my separate savings, and I would not promise to pretend the past happened. By midnight, it was clear we could not stay. Grabbed a duffel bag, stuffed a few changes of clothing, my encrypted USB drive, and my nurse aid. I texted Maya and she drove on to pick me up. As I got out the front door, Adrian stood in the door. He tried to stop me, but his final words hung sharp in air. "You will regret this choice. Everyone on this base." Maya's car pulled up, and I climbed the passenger seat. I watched the townhouse grow small in the mirror. My marriage was hanging in limbo. I had offered to pay every dollar back, yet ripped enough. It was never financial. It was about obedience. I would not give that to him. Maya reached her and squeezed my hand, saying nothing as we drove away from her apartment. Maya's small apartment felt foreign, a temporary safe harbor far removed from the rigid rhythm of base housing. For the first several days after moving out, I barely slept. My mind cycled through every conversation, every fight, every loaded comment Adrian had made over our marriage. I kept waiting for regret to crash over me, for me to second-guess walking away from the life I had planned. That regret never came. What I felt instead was bone-deep exhaustion. Adrian kept his threat. Word trickled back through military spouse connections. He told people I had consulted divorce lawyers out of nowhere, that I was ungrateful for the life he had given me, that I was abandoning my marriage despite all his sacrifices. He omitted every detail of the coercion, the unsigned promissory note, the repeated emotional pressure. Rumors swirled. Mutual acquaintances texted me cautious, pity-filled messages. Some sided with him outright. Others held their judgment, unsure which version of the story rang true. My mother remained unaware of the full collapse. She was still recovering, and I could not heap this crisis onto her already heavy shoulder. I visited her at the hospital each evening, putting on a calm, composed face. I told her Adrian and I were having marital growing pains, that we were taking space to work through conflict. I could not bring myself to tell her we had separated. Guilt nodded. Her life-threatening emergency had lit the fuse, even though none of this was her fault. My attorney pushed for structured mediation rather than rushing straight into divorce filing. Mediation would give us a neutral third-party space where we could lay out grievances without feeding the base community gossip. I gathered my evidence. Screenshots of manipulative text exchanges, the encrypted copy of Adrian's undated promissory note draft, notes I had jotted down after our worst fight. I printed everything, organized it into a plain manila folder. This was not ammunition to destroy. It was proof, so the mediator could understand the full context of what had unfolded. The mediation session was held in a quiet civilian law office, miles away from the military installation. No rank carried weight inside these four walls. Adrian arrived sharp and formal in his dress uniform, projecting the poised, respectable major everyone on base. I wore simple civilian clothes, my manila folder resting tight. The neutral mediator guided us through ground rules, giving each of us uninterrupted time. Adrian first. He recounted the night before wedding, framing his $50,000 transfer as a noble act of love. He spoke of his disappointment, of how he believed I had thrown away a good... His performance. If I had not lived every moment, I might have blew. When my turn arrived, I described my terror when the hospital demanded the emergency deposit. I told the mediator I had offered repayment from the... I explained how Adrian had rejected paybacks, how he brought the money into nearly every argument. I brought up the draft promissory note he had written and intentionally refused to sign. I laid out my 2-year repayment proposal once more, stating I was still fully willing to transfer it back. Adrian shifted in his chair, visibly unsettled as I presented. First time, he could not control the narrative or history. The mediator him directly. She asked why he would decline full repayment if the money itself what troubled him. For a long moment, Adrian sat silent. His military cracked. I did give money, he said finally, voice lower. I gave security. I expected loyalty in return. When she started pulling away, it felt like everything I thing. The mediator pointed out that loyalty could not be purchased with emergency funds. Financial support could not be traded for unconditional obedience. We spent hours going back and forth. Adrian would not concede that his behavior was manipulative. He alleged he had hurt me, yet he clung tightly to his belief that his generosity entitled him. We left mediation without an. No truce was struck. I reaffirmed my repayment offer in writing, sending a formal document over to his legal representation. Adrian did not accept it. We walked out of the office into cool autumn daylight, moved toward separate cars. There'd be no easy fix. The marriage might not survive. The weight of that truth settled over my shoulders. Yet there was also a quiet relief. I had finally gotten to the side of the story, outside the echo chamber of the military base. The weeks after mediation unfolded slowly, suspended in limbo. Adrian and I did not rush toward divorce, nor did we move toward reconciliation. Rumors on the base softened slightly once fragments of my perspective began to circulate quietly, though many people still clung to the original heroic story he had told. I kept living with Maya, kept my nursing hospital shifts, and kept making steady deposits into my separate personal savings account, still working toward that $50,000 sum. Whether he accepted it or not, paying it back mattered to my self-respect. My mother continued her slow recovery. She gained strength, could walk short distances without assistance, and one afternoon I sat beside her hospital bed and told her the whole truth. I laid out the emergency pre-wedding payment, the unwritten debt, the manipulation, the separation, and the failed mediation. She cried, heartbroken that her medical crisis had poisoned my marriage. She blamed herself, and I held her, telling her none of this was her fault. The cruelty was never in the emergency itself. It was in how Adrian had weaponized the rescue afterward. A few days later, she was discharged home. Adrian and I communicated mostly through our respective lawyers. There were no more screaming fights, no loaded late-night conversations. Occasionally, short formal emails would cross between us. Months slipped by. I kept sending the written repayment offer through legal channels, over and over. Then one cold December morning, his attorney sent a reply. Adrian would accept the $50,000 transfer, not as a restoration of our marriage, simply to close the chapter. I picked up every extra overtime shift I could get. I skipped vacations, cut all non-essential spending. Nights after long hospital shifts, I would sit at Maya's kitchen table calculating balance, watching my separate account creep upward toward the full number. It took just under 19 months. The day the final transfer cleared, I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage, staring at the confirmation screen on my... No grand celebration, no sense of triumph, only a quiet heavy release. That invisible moral weight I had carried since the night before my wedding was finally... We signed formal separation paperwork shortly after the payment. We chose not to file for immediate divorce. We agreed to 1 year of legal separation, giving both of us space to grow, without the pressure to rush a final permanent decision. Adrian would stay on base, focused on his military career. I found a small one-bedroom apartment of my own, not on base, within commuting distance of... We crossed paths once, by accident, in the grocery store commissary. He was in uniform, alone. Our eyes met at the aisle. There was no yelling, no sharp remarks. A brief, stiff nod was all. The $50,000 debt was $7, but the damage it had done could never... We could not go back to the people we had been before that terrible wedding. One evening, as autumn began, I sat on my... The air was cool, much like it had been on that terrible night years before. My mother for dinner. She was covered now, laughing as she helped me. Maya showed up too, bringing wine and takeout. No military rank over this space. No one lingered. I was just Lila, registered nurse friend, not someone forever indebted. I thought back to the girl sitting in Adrian's apartment before her wedding, destined to save her mom, believing that money comes. I understood now. Rescue that comes with hidden strings is never truly rescue. Kindness that demands endless gratitude in return is not kindness at all. Our story did not deliver a fairy conciliation. I did not fix Adrian and our marriage to heal. But I reclaimed myself. That was enough.